Hi there, I'm Lionel Windsor, New Testament lecturer at Moore Theological College in Sydney. This is part two of a wide-ranging chat that I had with my Old Testament colleague Chris Thomson about the meaning of righteousness and justification in the Bible. In the first part, we saw that righteousness is essentially a moral quality. It's about being right or good, as opposed to being wrong or bad. We also saw that this moral righteousness can be credited to someone by God. In this second part, we move on to talk about justification, which is really important for sinners like us. Just understanding, okay, that's righteousness. Now let's talk about justification. So you mentioned, so what's in the Old Testament? What's justification?
So justification, the verb to justify, which is the verb hitsdik in Hebrew,
which all come from the same root.
Comes from the same root, so zade dalet kof, and it's what we call a hifil form. The hifil is normally a causative type of verb. So Hebrew's, this is a side note, but Hebrew is a wonderful language, and it can express very elegantly things that in English we need quite a few words to express. So if you want to say, I caused him to kill her. For some reason, Hebrew always uses kill as a paradigm verb. It's actually not a common verb, but Hebrew tends to use the verb katal as a paradigm verb, but it only occurs a few times, but it's the verb kill for some reason. So that examples always come to mind that have to do with killing.
I know what you mean. That's right. In Greek, it's loose, and in you say, look, I loose, you loose, etc.
Yeah, but the Hebrew actually has a way of saying, I caused somebody to kill somebody else, and you use this hifil form. So you can actually say, I caused him to kill her. You could say that with just two words in Hebrew. So hitsdik is it's a causative form, and most of the time, the subject of the verb, the person doing the action, is a judge. So it presupposes a courtroom setting, and it presupposes the setting where a judge is passing judgment. Now, I happen to think that what the word really means is he caused a person to be justified. Okay, so he caused a person, he gave judgment in favor of a person. He ruled in favor of a person. So if you and I were in court and, I have some dispute with you and the judge finds in my favor, then this is the verb that you would use to say, he found in favor of me. Now, it's often said that this particular hifil verb is a declarative hifil. And the reason that people say that is typically the way that judges pass judgment is by actually making a declaration. They'll say, I hereby judge you innocent, or I judge you guilty, or whatever it might be. And so people say, well, that's what this verb is expressing. It's expressing the judge making a statement. I actually happen to think, and this is an article that I'm hoping to submit for publication later in the year, I actually think that's a mistake to think that the hifil has a declarative meaning. It's actually normally only said of these two verbs. There are one or two others that occasionally are said to have this declarative sense, but it's only the verbs justify and condemn that where the hifil is said to have a declarative sense. And I think what people are doing is they're reading in the context, a bit like we talked about earlier, where the covenant gets read into the meaning of words like zedek and zadik. I think what people do is they read into this word hitsdik, the context in which they imagine the judge making a statement and think that the verb itself is expressing the idea of the judge making a statement. But I think what it actually expresses, and this fits with both the grammar and with a few contexts in which the verb appears, like 1 Kings 8, it actually expresses the judge executing judgment, finding in favor. And so in 1 Kings 8, it envisages a scenario where two people have a dispute and come before the Lord in his temple, and it asks God to decide between them, justifying the righteous by giving to him in accordance with his righteousness, and to condemn the wicked by bringing his deeds back on his head. So it's the verb, I think, that it refers to the judge bringing about justice.
Can I clarify that? I think I know where you're getting at, but so the reason that before we've had this conversation, and I think I remember you mentioned this before as well, and it's made me think, but before you'd mentioned this, the reason I would have said that it's declarative is simply because in this law court context, what the judge is doing is looking at the righteousness of the person, or looking at the person, and it's actually the righteousness of the person. If the judge is just and perfectly able to assess the situation, assuming ideal situation, then it's actually the righteousness of the person which will end up determining whether or not the judge actually says righteous or unrighteous.
Absolutely.
So if the criminal comes before the court and they've done the wrong thing, then the judge will say not guilty. Sorry, will say guilty. And if
it's a just judge, yeah.
If they're a just judge under ideal circumstances. And then if someone comes before the court and they're innocent, then the judge will declare them innocent. And so there's a sense in which if the judge is a perfect ideal judge, then it's actually, there's no decision that the judge makes, and there's nothing that the judge actually does to make the person justified except investigate the matter and make the declaration. So that's why I would have said, it's declarative. But it sounds like you're saying there's actually something that the judge is actually doing to the person, and that is before the judge did the hit stick, before he actually did that, they were not something, and then after he did it, they were something. Is that right? So he's actually done something to them. He's not made them righteous. He hasn't sort of turned them from being innocent into guilty or something, but he's done something. What's he actually done to them?
Yeah. Before I come on to that question of what he's done, let me just say, I think that's exactly right. I think that's the gist of what I'm saying, is that it's a verb that causes something, not a verb that declares something. And one of the reasons for saying that is Hebrew has another verb form, the PL, which is typically the form, if somebody, if you say about somebody that they are righteous, use the PL form. Okay. And that's the form that it's you don't have to be a judge to say. I could say, I could declare you, Lana Windsor, to be righteous. I would use the PL form for that. And there's been a fair bit of discussion about the difference.
I'd like to come back to this. This is a side point, but might be relevant in the future. Is Declarative the Greek translation for both the PL and the Hifil, or is it only the?
No, but we can come back to that.
Okay, come back to that. Right. Yep. What does the judge do? Yeah, what's the judge?
That's right. What does the judge do? So, but the other thing is that I think we're reading in context when we say it's about a declaration. Not one of those instances. One of the things you have to do when you do this work of word study, lexical semantics, is you have to ask what's the word conveying, and what's kind of maybe implied by the context. So, you're ordained. So have you ever married anyone? I know you've married Bronwyn.
Yes.
Have you ever married a couple?
Yes.
So the way that you marry a couple in the Anglican Church is I'm not ordained, I've never done this, but you hold their hands together and you say, I hereby declare you man and wife. Now, when you talk about marrying them, the key thing is not that you declared them man and wife, you made them man and wife. So I would say that the fact that you do it by making a declaration is not what's meant when you use the word marry in that sense. Or if you sell me your car, part of that transaction might be me handing over money and you saying it's yours. But we don't interpret the verb sell as meaning say about the car, it is yours. But that's what people do with this word hit steak. And I think the reason they do that, and this is what I'll be arguing in my article, is they look at the word sardak, which is the verb in the cow form, so the simple form, which corresponds to the hifil form. And they say that the cow form means be righteous. And they say, well, the hifil doesn't mean cause to be righteous. So it must mean declare to be righteous.
So they've got two possibilities in their head.
Yeah, but they overlook the fact that the cal verb doesn't just mean be righteous. It can also mean be justified. So it can also be used, in English, it would be the passive verb. If I go to court and the judge basically finds in my favor, then I am justified. I can use the word zadak. And those two meanings are linked. Normally it's the righteous person, as you were saying earlier, who is justified. But I think realizing that the cal verb can mean be justified helps us understand how the hifil verb can mean cause to be justified. So going back to your question of what is the judge actually causing? What is the judge doing? I would say the judge is causing justification, which sounds circular, but in Hebrew it's not circular because the most basic form of the verb is actually the verb be justified. What does that mean? I think it means that you are the person who you're vindicated, you're the one who is found to be in the right, and you're therefore the one who receives the benefits that accrue to the person who's in the right. So if you're being accused of something, then you're acquitted. If it's a civil case and if I'm saying you owe me money and the judge justifies me, it means I get my money. So that's what the judge is causing.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, in a sense, it's causing a verdict. It's causing an evaluation. But it's not causing a change in me. It's causing a change in my legal status.
That's helpful. And that's why it matters to distinguish righteousness and justification, even though they're to be righteous is to be morally right. To be justified is to have that status that's been actually given to you, which actually means that you get the benefits of being morally right, which you might not otherwise have had if you're before the court. Okay.
Exactly. And I think that's why it's important to ask what is the context here. And so I think that's why when we come to Pauline theology, it's really, really important to ask what is the law court situation that is in view here. And I think that's where, again, there would be a difference between probably you and me on the one hand and Tom Wright on the other hand, where he thinks that the decisive question is not, it's not, God contending with his people over their sins. It's God's people and their enemies contending. And I think that's sometimes why Tom Wright doesn't answer the questions that we'd like him to answer, is because he thinks they're the wrong question. So I think that question of what is the law court in view becomes really relevant at that point. But yeah, in the Hebrew Bible, I would say that justification, when it's that hifil verb, is normally it's about 8 out of 10 times it's a judge. There are two cases where it isn't. One is Daniel 12, where I think it means to cause someone to be righteous, so not to cause someone to be justified, but to cause someone to be righteous. And the other is Isaiah 53. And what's interesting in Isaiah 53 is that it does seem to be a sort of well, there are different opinions on Isaiah 53, but I think the servant, who's the one who's said to justify many,
the righteous one will justify many, isn't he? Sorry, just
I beg your pardon?
It's by well, I'm going from memory here, but it's my righteous one will justify many by his something. I can't even remember what it is now, but it's by his something or other. My righteous one will justify many. Yeah,
I think it's by his righteousness. But I can
even by his righteousness, which is why I was confused.
But but the really striking thing in that passage is that he's not acting in the capacity of judge, and I think that's one of the places where it's actually quite helpful to see that the hifil is normally causative. So I think what it's saying is that he's causing many to be justified. So let's have a look.
It's by his knowledge. Okay. Sorry, I've got that in the...
So the word by his knowledge, depending how you read it, it either comes at the end of the first half of the verse or it comes at the beginning of the second half of the verse. But according to the ancient scribes, it belongs with the first half of the verse. And so the second half is just a righteous one, my servant, will justify many, and their sins he will bear. So you've got those two ideas, that he's going to justify them and he's going to bear their sins. And I think the theology expressed that, and it is unique. And I think that's one of the reasons why Isaiah 53 is one of the most hotly contested passages in the Hebrew Bible, because a lot of people say, well, this is an idea that's alien to the Hebrew Bible. And I think it is unique. But I think you have there the idea that by bearing sin, the servant brings about the justification of many people.
Who are sinners.
Sorry?
Yeah. Many people who are sinners. That is, he doesn't
bring about sinners,
so righteous, but of sinners.
Yeah, and I think the idea is that he's taking their sins onto himself, and that by taking their sins away, he enables them to have the declaration of innocence before God, which I think is the same theology you find in Psalm 32, where Psalm 32 is really a psalm about forgiveness. And it talks about sins not being counted, sins not being credited. But what's really interesting in Romans 4 is that Paul uses an example of righteousness being counted. And I think that reflects the fact that in the Hebrew Bible, as I said earlier, sin and righteousness are opposites. And if your sins are not counted, then by definition, you're innocent, you're righteous. And so it seems to me that what Paul's doing by citing Psalm 32, which, by the way, is a psalm of David. David is an Israelite. Paul certainly would have read it as a Davidic psalm. But for some reason, Tom Wright thinks this is all about God bringing Gentiles into his people. Seems to me it's not a psalm about God bringing Gentiles into his people. Yeah. I think he's reading that because he thinks Abraham was a Gentile. And so I think he thinks that Psalm 32 isn't, I think he's using the wider context of Romans 4, but I read it completely differently. I think in Romans 4, what he's saying is that by forgiving sins, God is counting us as righteous, that forgiveness and justification are two sides of the same coin. Would that fit with your reading of Paul on it?
It would, yeah. And certainly. I think, so to just go back a little bit, but I think we're moving forward at the same time. That the Greek word dikaion, dikaion, depending on how you want to say it, is the word that we're talking about that is translated as to justify. And certainly amongst the reformers, the key debate or the key issue that they had was between two possibilities. And one was the possibility from Augustine that had been so strong, which actually really comes from as far as I can see, it's the Latin is very strong influence on this, and that is that from Augustine, the word to justify actually means, it's causative. It means to make. What it means is to make righteous, and so it's actually for Augustine and many who followed him in the medieval time. And in exegesis, when they saw justification, they were actually thinking, well, actually to make somebody righteous. So what God does to us is that he, through baptism, he gives us that perfect status, but then through our life and through penance and various, as we do what is right, God's grace makes us more and more righteous. And that's what justification is. So there's a sense of justification at the beginning of our Christian lives, but it's not complete until the end of our Christian lives because God is making us righteous. He's making us morally good. And so no quibbles over the meaning of righteousness that the reformers had with anyone, but the issue was really over the meaning of the word justify. And for them, the other alternative was it's not actually to make righteous. And they say it's to declare righteous. It's to say this person is indeed righteous. So they would say it's declarative. But I think what you've said fills it out a little bit more and gives it just a little bit more helpful nuance. You could say it's not to make righteous, it's to make justify. That is to declare that a person is indeed righteous but actually by conferring that status of justified upon them. And so it's causative, not just declarative. But in that debate, is it make righteous or declare righteous? The answer, I guess, is declare righteous. But The nuance is actually, well, no, but it's more than just a declaration. It's not just that God sort of goes, oh, this person happens to be righteous. There's actually a real something that's actually going on there.
It's a declaration that does something. It's a declaration that changes your status before God.
Yes, yeah. And that is particularly, sorry, I cut you off there.
Well, no, and I think that's important to say, because I think sometimes people take this idea of declaration and they take it a step further to say, well, you're just saying what's already the case. So for Tom Wright, justification, I think, is to do with, saying that somebody is one of the people of God, but that's already happened. You've already become one of the people of God. And so he makes justification less sort of theologically loaded by saying, well, it's only God saying what's already happened. It's not about how you get into the people of God. It's about God saying who is in the people of God. And so I want to say, and I think Simon Gathercole makes this point in a fairly old essay now, but it's actually, it's a declaration that changes something. And I think the weight in the Hebrew word, at least, is not on the declaration. By the way, going back to your question earlier about the Septuagint, when it translates the PL, and this is taking me back a few years, so I'd need to kind of check my notes. There are at least some places where it actually has a sort of, it uses a phrase. So it says to say that they are righteous or something like this. So it doesn't use Declarative, but I think Declarative in the New Testament is sometimes used with that sense of to show righteous. Wisdom is justified by her works, for example. Or I think James 2, which is a key passage. I don't know if this is, I don't know if this is right or not. I'd be interested in getting a New Testament scholar like yourself to comment. But I wonder if in James 2, when James talks about how you're justified by your works, that it's something like that PL sense of you're shown to be righteous by your works. And that's in Ezekiel, you do get that when Ezekiel is criticizing the Judeans and saying, well, the Israelites have actually, you've made them look righteous. He uses the PL of Zardak, but by your ungodliness. It's not changing their status, but it's how they look. It's how you're making them. It's what you're saying about them. I wonder if that's what James is saying about our deeds, and I wonder if that's that fits with the timeline of Abraham's life that James is talking about. That he, in Genesis 22, when he offers Isaac, he's justified. Well, God's already credited righteousness to him in Genesis 15, but now he's showing himself to be righteous. He's been declared righteous by his deeds. So I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit new to me, so I need to look at it, but it does make sense of what James says, because James's point is it's about showing, show me. That's his issue, and the question is that he's got is, well, you've got this faith. Well, how do we know if it's actually a living faith, or the kind of faith that demons have, where they just say, that they know God is one, and they are able to declare that? Well, no, it actually needs to, if we're going to actually see whether that faith actually makes a real difference, or if that faith is real, then we need to actually see if it's doing something in your life. And so perhaps that is the case. So I need to look at that in more detail, actually, but I think that is helpful, because the whole issue with James is that James says that a man is justified by his works and not faith alone. And so that seems to not square with Paul, but I think that would be, really interesting to look up and to consider what James is seeking to say, and the issues that James has, which have to do with living the Christian life and wisdom. Anyway, they're my reflections on it. It's just made me think I'd like to read that James chapter 2 again and see. But going back to Romans 4, and also just Paul's other discussions about justification, the issue which which I think has been lurking behind everything that we've been saying, but just to now bring it out into the open, is now that we've got that, okay, this is what righteousness is. It's a moral quality. Justification is conferring a righteous status upon someone, perhaps, or saying that it's declaring, but it's more than declaring. And as we said, a just judge, what they do is that they only justify the righteous and they condemn the guilty. And God is a just judge, and he is a perfectly just judge. So he will not justify the unrighteous, and he will condemn the guilty. That's the entire understanding that we have from the Old Testament. And it's the understanding that we have not only from the Old Testament, from the contemporary Jewish contemporaries of Paul.
Yeah, God says that explicitly in Exodus, I will not justify the wicked. And I think the Septuagint uses the word ungodly there, I think.
Ungodly, asabaya, yeah.
Yeah, which is the same word for using Romans.
Yeah, so Romans chapter 4, verse 5. This is such a significant verse. Not only is it a statement about what God does, but it's actually a statement about who God is. That God is the one who justifies the ungodly.
Right.
If you want to say, well, that's not exactly the same as unrighteous, well, that's what you mentioned in the Old Testament it is. And also back in chapter 1, verse 18 of Romans, Paul has put together unrighteousness and ungodliness as two sides of the same coin. So that's not a easy, straightforward to understand statement that you go, oh yes, that makes perfect sense. Yes, of course, God's the one who justifies the ungodly. I understand that. No, it's shocking. It's utterly shocking. It's theologically, it's an explosion of immense proportions theologically to say that God is the one who justifies the ungodly. That could not be heard as anything other than blasphemy almost. It's a shocking, not quite blasphemy, but it's getting there. It's a shocking statement. Would you agree that that's a shocking thing to say in the context?
I would. I mean, I think it's, well, yes and no. I mean, what's striking as an Old Testament scholar is, it's very noticeable in the Old Testament that there are lots of exceptions. I mentioned earlier that there's this basic framework whereby God punishes wickedness and he rewards righteousness. But there are lots of places where that doesn't happen. There are lots of places where somebody commits a sin, often a very heinous sin, and God forgives them. And at that point, you're left wondering, well, how does God do that? And I'm not thinking here of the kind of sins that the sacrificial system deals with. So in Leviticus 4 and 5 and in Leviticus 16 with the Day of Atonement, there are certain sins that can be dealt with through animal sacrifices. That it's a limited. Opinions differ on the Day of Atonement. Some people would say the Day of Atonement is effectual for a larger number of sins, but it's debated. In Leviticus 4 and 5 with the sin offering or the purification offering and the guilt offering, it's very limited. There are certain sins, there is no sacrifice that can atone for them. There's no sacrifice that can atone for murder. There's no sacrifice that can atone for adultery. And yet David, when he commits both of those sins, Nathan comes to him, confronts him with his sin. David says, I've sinned against the Lord. And Nathan says, the Lord has taken away your sin. In other words, the Lord has forgiven your sin. And we're not told why God does that, or we're not told on what basis God is able to be just and holds one person's sin against them and another person's sin not hold against them. And I think that's what is the tension that Paul is explaining in Romans 3, which of course comes before Romans 4.
Yes.
Where he addresses the question of how can God be just and be the justifier of those who have faith in Jesus. And he talks about the offering of Jesus. And I think that's significant. So I think in the Old Testament, the idea that God justifies or seems to let off ungodly people, it's it's anomalous in a sense, but it happens. People does show favor. The guy in Psalm 32, I mean, it even happens quite a lot. Psalm 32 seems to be quite general. If you confess your sins to the Lord, then he won't hold them against you. But we're not told on what basis. And I think Isaiah 53 is I think, in the background for Paul, because I think Isaiah 53 is the passage that ties all this together. The idea of a substitute bearing sin, the idea of justification, the idea of a sort of, perhaps even a sort of priestly sprinkling, some of that language there in Isaiah 53. So I think in Romans 3, Paul is saying that the offering of Jesus is what enables God to be just and the justifier. And he refers to the sins that were passed over beforehand. And I think that would refer to the whole old...
that he's left unpunished.
So I think that would refer to sins like David's sin. Because, David himself in Psalm 51 acknowledges that blood of bulls and goats can't deal with his sin. And yet he uses language associated with the temple, cleanse me with hyssop, and so on. I think what David is saying in Psalm 51 is, I need you to forgive me my sin and cleanse me from my sin. I need you to do the kind of thing that the temple system, the sacrificial system does, but I know an animal sacrifice won't cut it. And I think in Isaiah 53, where we see the servant of the Lord dying for sin, we actually see the one sacrifice that does. And so I think in Romans 3, Paul is saying that that's what Jesus did when he offers himself on the cross, was he died as that atoning sacrifice for sin. And that's the basis on which I think Romans 4, God is able to justify the ungodly.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So I said it's theologically shocking. If it were just said by itself, maybe it would be. But what Paul's doing is saying something that I guess is theologically shocking, and yet has been prepared for by so much of the Old Testament, by the Psalms, by Isaiah 53 in particular, and which Paul has just referred to all those things in talking about the death of Jesus for our sins in our place, in the context of justification. Yeah, so
it's fair to say that Tom Wright would also see it as theologically shocking, but he thinks the theological shock is not God taking an ungodly person and treating them as though they're righteous. He thinks the theological shock is God taking a Gentile and including them in his people. So for Tom Wright, justification is ecclesiological. It's about who is in the family of God. And he thinks the big shock of the gospel is that Gentiles are included. And that the big shock is not that ungodly people are treated as righteous.
And just to do that, I can see that, but to do that, it doesn't seem to make sense of the actual words that Paul is using here. If he were wanting to say that, he could have said that by using, for example, the word covenant or the word people or those kinds of words.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why that question of what the words righteousness, justification, what those words mean in their original Old Testament context, and to some extent in the post-Old Testament, pre-New Testament context, that's why that becomes all important. I mean, I have a quote from Tom Wright, which I started my paper with, or maybe ended my paper with when I presented him. He says, I've lost it, but the gist of it is that he says, look, if you have a word that's always used to mean a particular thing in the Old Testament, your starting point, here we go. When we meet a word or term which is used in a consistent way across a range of literature of a particular period, and when we then meet the same word or term in an author we're studying, the natural presumption is that the word or term means there what it means elsewhere. Until, that is, the context rebels, producing a sense so odd that we're forced to say, wait a minute, something seems to be wrong. Is there another meaning for this word which we were taking for granted? So what he's saying is that, basically, when you read Paul, you need to know, well, what does that word mean in the period leading up to Paul? But because he's convinced that the word means, that the word righteous means to be one of God's people, and because he's convinced that the word justifies to do with being declared to be one of God's people, he's forced to read Paul in a particular way. Whereas I think if I'm right and righteousness is a moral quality, and that justification is about finding in someone's favor on the basis of that moral quality, whether it's theirs intrinsically or whether you're crediting them with it, then I think it absolutely leads into the kind of understanding of Romans 4 that we've been discussing.
And that's the end of part 2. In part 3, we move on to talk about why all this talk of righteousness and justification matters for us, and how it helps us to read Paul's letter to the Romans.